Becoming dangerously smart is not about having the highest IQ, knowing the most facts, or sounding clever in conversations. It's about developing the kind of intelligence that quietly gives you advantage, an ability to read situations, anticipate outcomes, make fewer mistakes, and move through life with precision instead of confusion. When someone is dangerously smart, they stop being a passive participant in life and start becoming a strategist, one who chooses their moves instead of reacting to circumstances. In this audiobook, we will explore the mental tools, habits, and ways of thinking that elevate you beyond average reasoning. You will learn how clarity beats noise, how information becomes leverage, how emotional discipline shapes outcomes, and how the smartest people make decisions, communicate, observe, and build advantage. The goal is not for you to be admired intellectually, but to become effective, someone whose thinking produces results. You will notice that the most strategic minds do not rush. They do not panic. They see patterns where others see randomness, and they position themselves for outcomes instead of hoping for luck. These are learnable skills, and once you begin to adopt them, life changes in subtle yet powerful ways. Opportunities become visible, mistakes become preventable, and success becomes less dependent on chance. In this audiobook, we will think deeply, but we will also stay practical. Everything shared here is designed to be usable. Ideas you can apply immediately in decision-making relationships, business, learning, time management, and personal growth. If you're ready to stop guessing and start understanding, if you're ready to move from reacting to anticipating, and if you're ready to think like a strategist, instead of just hoping life works out, then you're in the right place. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Start with clarity, or stay confused forever. Clarity is the first step toward becoming dangerously smart, because without clarity, every other improvement becomes guesswork. When you're unclear, you don't know what to aim at, you don't know what matters, you don't know what to ignore. And without those distinctions, life becomes exhausting. You end up moving, but not progressing, working, but not achieving, thinking, but not understanding. Clarity removes that fog. It's the mental lens that makes everything sharper, simpler, and more strategic. And here's the truth. Most people eventually learn the hard way. Confusion is expensive. It wastes time. It wastes energy. And it makes you settle for whatever lands in front of you, instead of what you truly want. Clarity is not just knowing what you want. It is knowing why you want it, and what price you're willing to pay to get it. Without the why, your goals collapse under pressure. Without the price, your goals remain fantasies. And this is where dangerously smart people separate themselves. They don't just dream, they define. They don't just hope, they plan. They don't just react, they direct. They take the time to think. They take the time to decide what matters and in what order. And once they choose, they move with purpose. One of the greatest advantages clarity gives you is the ability to say no when you don't know what you're aiming at. Everything looks like an opportunity, but when you do know, most things immediately reveal themselves as distractions. And distractions are the silent enemy of intelligent living. They don't always look harmful. Sometimes they look exciting. Sometimes they look profitable. Sometimes they feel urgent. But if they don't move you closer to what matters, they're just noise dressed up as options. Clarity protects you from that noise. Now, here's something important. Clarity doesn't appear by accident. It must be created. It must be earned. You earn clarity by thinking deeply instead of rushing. You earn clarity by asking better questions. Questions like, what am I actually trying to achieve? What outcome do I want? What would success look like here? What would failure look like? What resources do I have? What resources do I lack? Who wins if I don't change? Who wins if I do? When you give your mind real questions, it gives you real answers. And real answers give you power. Notice how clarity simplifies decision-making. When you're clear, decisions become faster. When you're unclear, decisions become heavier. You hesitate, you overthink, you delay, you wait for permission, you wait for signs. You wait for something or someone to make the choice for you. And waiting is one of the most costly habits in life. Opportunities rarely wait. People rarely wait. Time never waits. Clarity cuts through that hesitation. Another advantage of clarity is emotional stability. When you know what you're doing and why, you don't panic every time there's friction or resistance. You don't abandon your plan because someone doubts you. You don't spiral into insecurity every time the results are slow. You expect turbulence. Because turbulence doesn't scare people who know where they're going. Only the lost panic when the weather changes. Becoming dangerously smart begins here. Because clarity is the foundation upon which every strategic improvement is built. Without clarity, strategy turns into improvisation. Without clarity, learning turns into trivia. Without clarity, effort turns into exhaustion. But with clarity, effort compounds. With clarity, learning translates into advantage. With clarity, decisions become intentional and intelligent. If you want to make your life harder than it needs to be, stay unclear. But if you want to make your life sharper, more strategic and more effective, start with clarity. Define your target. Define your priorities. Define your boundaries. Because the moment you become clear, confusion loses its power over you. Chapter 2. Turn information into advantage. Information by itself is not power. If it were, the highest achievers in the world would simply be the ones who knew the most facts or consumed the most content. Yet that's not how life works. The people who win are the ones who know how to turn information into usable insight, into leverage, into strategy, into advantage. That's what makes someone dangerously smart. They don't just collect information, they convert it. We live in a time where information is everywhere. And because it's everywhere, it's easy to drown in it. You can scroll for hours, watch videos for hours, read articles for hours and still not get smarter, still not make better decisions, still not move forward. That's because information without direction becomes noise. And noise doesn't help you. It distracts you to get smarter. You need a filter. You need a purpose. You need a way to decide what's useful and what's just entertainment, disguised as learning. Dangerously smart people don't chase random information. They look for patterns, they look for principles, and they look for relevance. Relevance matters. Knowledge that is not relevant to your goals has no strategic value. It might be interesting to know. It might make you sound clever at a party, but it won't help you become effective. Real intelligence respects priorities. Here's something most people never think about. Every piece of information has a different purpose. Some information helps you make faster decisions. Some helps you avoid mistakes. Some helps you recognize opportunities. Some helps you understand people. And some helps you understand yourself. The key is learning to categorize information. Instead of letting it blend into a single blob of random facts, let's slow down here for a moment, because this matters. Smart people don't just ask, "What is this?" They ask, "How can I use this?" That single shift changes everything. When you start seeing information as potential leverage, your brain stops being a storage unit and becomes a processing center. And processing centers are more valuable than storage units. For example, financial information can help you make better investment decisions. Career information can help you navigate your industry. Psychological information can help you read behavior, and strategic information can help you plan moves ahead. When you understand the purpose of information, you start pairing it with action. And knowledge paired with action becomes power. Another advantage dangerously smart people have is that they're always connecting dots. When most people learn something new, it sits isolated in their mind, like a single puzzle piece. But when strategic thinkers learn something new, they immediately ask themselves, where does this fit? They match patterns. They compare. They integrate. They look for second-order effects. Over time, those connections form maps, mental maps of how things work. And once you have mental maps, the world stops being confusing. This is important for another reason. Maps help you navigate. Without maps, you get lost. Without maps, you rely on guessing. Without maps, you depend on luck. But when you have maps, decisions become easier. You know where you are, you know where you're going, and you know what paths exist between those 2 points. The most intelligent minds don't just learn, they organize what they learn. Now, let's talk about the enemy of intelligent learning: passive consumption. Passive consumption feels like learning. It gives you the sensation of progress. But sensation is not the same as improvement. Passive consumption is like eating without digesting. You're full, but you're not nourished. You have more, but you're not better. To become dangerously smart, you must move from passive learning to active learning. Active learning is when you pause, reflect, question, analyze, and apply. It's slower than passive consumption, but vastly more powerful. Here's another habit smart thinkers develop. They take notes, but not just any notes. They don't write down everything. They write down patterns, frameworks, and insights. They summarize concepts in their own words, because summarizing forces understanding. And once you understand something deeply, you never really lose it. Dangerously smart people also learn from other people, both directly and indirectly. They observe how successful people think, how they solve problems, how they make decisions, how they respond under pressure. They pay attention to behaviors, not just words. The world becomes their classroom. And when you treat the world as a classroom, opportunities to learn appear everywhere, because everything becomes data: wins, losses, failures, mistakes, conversations, industries, markets, relationships, trends, and even silence at a higher level. Information becomes advantage when you combine 3 skills: acquisition, interpretation, and application. Acquisition gives you raw material. Interpretation gives you understanding. Application gives you results. If any of the 3 are missing, the system breaks. If you acquire but don't interpret, you have noise. If you interpret but don't apply, you have theory. If you apply without acquisition or interpretation, you have blind action. Intelligence requires all 3. To close this chapter, remember one thing: information ages quickly, but insight compounds. And the people who become dangerously smart are the ones who learn to extract insight, not just accumulate data. They know how to think, not just what to think. And once you learn how to think, life becomes a game. You can finally play with strategy instead of confusion, intention instead of impulse, and advantage instead of hope. Chapter 3. Play long-term games in a short-term world. If you want to become dangerously smart, you must learn to think beyond the moment. Most of the suffering, confusion, and stress people experience comes from reacting to the short term. They want quick relief, quick rewards, quick validation, and quick progress. The problem is that the quick path is almost always the shallow path. It gives you speed, but not distance. It gives you sensation, but not transformation. Long-term thinking requires patience, but it builds results that last and results that compound. And compounding is one of the most powerful forces a smart person can use. Let's pause on that word for a second. Compounding. Compounding is not just a financial concept. It applies to skills, relationships, reputation, knowledge habits, health discipline, credibility, and even opportunities. When you think long-term, you allow compounding to work in your favor. When you think short-term, you interrupt compounding, just as it's about to get interesting. This is why so many people never get extraordinary results. They quit too early, they change direction too frequently, or they panic too easily, and panic is the enemy of progress. Playing long-term games means valuing endurance over excitement. It means building systems instead of chasing events. It means positioning yourself for where you want to be, not where it's easiest to stand today. And here's the paradox. To the long-term thinkers, eventually win the short-term game too. Why? Because they make fewer desperate decisions. They build real competence, and they accumulate advantage quietly over time. By the time others are waking up to the opportunity, the long-term thinkers have already positioned themselves for it. Let's talk about attention for a moment. The world today is optimized for short-term stimulation. Notifications everywhere, constant updates, endless entertainment, instant communication, fast results. On the surface, this seems convenient, but underneath, it makes people mentally fragile. They lose the ability to sit with discomfort, to wait, to focus deeply, to build something brick by brick. Dangerous intelligence requires exactly the opposite. It requires the ability to delay gratification, to sit with ambiguity, and to think in horizons instead of impulses. When you think long-term, you stop asking what feels good right now and start asking what will matter in 5 years. That single shift creates different choices. You treat relationships differently. You treat your career differently. You treat your learning differently. You especially treat your mistakes differently. Short-term thinkers hide their mistakes to protect their ego. Long-term thinkers study their mistakes to protect their future. Playing long-term games also changes how you interact with people. When you think long-term, you value trust over transaction. You make decisions that strengthen your reputation instead of damaging it for quick wins. You invest in relationships instead of extracting from them. And over time, that builds a network of allies, not just contacts. Allies are powerful. Allies open doors. Allies vouch for you. Allies warn you about threats before they arrive. Allies create opportunities you could never manufacture alone. That's long-term leverage. Another area where long-term thinking creates advantage is skill building. Most people want to be good quickly, so they look for shortcuts. But shortcuts produce shallow skill. Long-term thinkers aren't afraid of the boring fundamentals. They're not in a hurry to be impressive. They're in a hurry to be capable. And capability is priceless. Capable people can adapt. Capable people can pivot. Capable people stay valuable no matter the environment. In a world that changes rapidly, adaptability is the real currency. Here's another interesting truth. Long-term thinking makes you emotionally stronger. When you operate in short-term mode, every setback feels catastrophic because it's judged within a tiny window. But when you think long-term, setbacks become data. A failed attempt is just one iteration out of many. A slow season is just a chapter, not the entire book. Emotional volatility decreases because perspective increases, and emotional stability is one of the greatest forms of intelligence because it preserves clarity under pressure. Thinking long-term also changes your relationship with time itself. You stop seeing time as something you spend and start seeing time as something you invest. If you spend time, the best case is that you enjoyed it. The worst case is that you wasted it. But if you invest time, you expect a return. And returns come in many forms. Skill returns, knowledge returns, health returns, financial returns, opportunity returns, relationship returns. Time becomes a tool, not just something you watch pass by. Now here's the twist. Playing long-term games isn't about waiting forever without action. It's about acting now so that the future becomes easier. Dangerous intelligence is not passive intelligence. It's intentional intelligence. It's doing things today that make tomorrow richer in options and lighter in stress. And the earlier you adopt this mindset, the more powerful the compounding becomes. Starting late is still better than never starting, but starting early creates exponential results. And this brings us to a final point worth emphasizing. Long-term thinking requires faith in the unseen. You don't always see immediate proof that what you're doing is working. You don't always get applause. You don't always feel progress. And that's why so many people quit, not because the path doesn't work, but because it works quietly at first. But quietly is how compounding always begins. Loud is how it ends. And the people who become dangerously smart are the ones who can endure the quiet long enough to enjoy the loud. Chapter 4. Train your pattern recognition. One of the most underestimated signs of true intelligence is the ability to recognize patterns, not just to notice events, but to connect them. Not just to observe what people do, but to understand why they do it and what they will likely do next. When you develop pattern recognition, life stops feeling random. Outcomes stop feeling mysterious. You begin to predict instead of react. And prediction, even partial prediction, gives you a tremendous strategic advantage. Everything in life has patterns. Markets have patterns. Human behavior has patterns. Conflict has patterns. Success has patterns. Failure has patterns. Health has patterns. Relationships have patterns. Even emotions have patterns. The people who feel constantly blindsided by life are usually the ones who haven't learned to look beyond the immediate moment. They judge things by how they appear, not by how they develop. Smart thinkers judge things by trajectories. They don't just ask, "What is happening?" They ask, "Where is this leading?" That question alone separates amateurs from strategists. Because what matters most in life is not the event itself, but the direction the event is pointing toward. A habit repeated is a pattern forming. A pattern forming is a future being created. That's why dangerously smart people pay attention early. They don't wait for consequences to become unavoidable. They adjust when the signals are subtle, not when the damage is obvious. Pattern recognition also makes you less emotional when dealing with people. When you understand patterns, you stop taking everything personally. You stop interpreting people's actions as isolated incidents and start seeing them as part of a behavioral script. Someone who avoids accountability will avoid it again. Someone who blames will keep blaming. Someone who lies will lie again. Someone who does the bare minimum will continue doing the bare minimum. Once you see the pattern, their behavior loses its power to frustrate you. This also protects you from manipulation. People who can't recognize patterns are easy to mislead because they judge every situation as if it's new. They fall for the same stories, the same promises, the same emotional hooks. People who recognize patterns learn quickly. They don't need to experience pain 10 times to understand what's happening. Once is data, twice is confirmation. 3 times is a rule pattern. Recognition is also one of the foundations of strategic decision-making. Great investors, great negotiators, great leaders, great communicators, great thinkers, they all rely heavily on patterns. They observe the past to predict the future, not because the future will be identical, but because human behavior and systemic dynamics rarely change. As much as people pretend, circumstances change, tools change, styles change, but the underlying human drivers, fear, greed, ambition, insecurity, curiosity, pride, love, and self-preservation, remain remarkably consistent. Here's where it gets interesting. Pattern recognition is not something you're either born with or not. It is trainable. It begins with paying attention and slowing down your interpretation. Most people jump to conclusions instantly. They react quickly, label quickly, categorize quickly, but fast. Labeling kills pattern detection. To detect patterns, you need to observe without rushing. To explain, you need to notice repetition. You need to ask, have I seen something like this before? Under what conditions? With what results? Another powerful way to develop pattern recognition is to learn across domains. When you learn from different fields, psychology, business history, strategy, communication, you start seeing how principles repeat. For example, you might notice that winners in business are often the ones who can delay gratification, just like winners in fitness or winners in investing. The domain changes, but the pattern stays the same. The more cross-domain knowledge you build, the more transferable your pattern recognition becomes. Now, let's talk about feedback loops. Patterns become clear when you track outcomes over time. If you never measure anything, you never notice repetition. This applies to your own behavior too. If every year feels the same, it's not because the world isn't changing. It's because your patterns aren't changing. You keep choosing the same actions, the same reactions, the same habits. Leaders and top performers study their own patterns as critically as they study external ones. They ask, what keeps happening to me and why? That question alone can save someone 5 years of repeating the same cycle. Pattern recognition also affects how you interpret opportunities. Some people get lucky once and don't know why it happened. They can't repeat the success because they don't understand the pattern behind it. Others build success systematically because they understand not only what worked, but why it worked. And if you understand why something works, you can recreate it, improve it, and scale it. That's how advantage is built intelligently. not accidentally. There's another benefit worth mentioning. Pattern recognition reduces fear. When the world feels random, fear increases. When the world feels structured, fear decreases, even if the structure isn't perfect, even if the prediction isn't guaranteed. The mere act of understanding trajectories creates psychological stability. You stop feeling like life is happening to you and start feeling like you are interacting with a system you can learn, adapt to, and influence. To become dangerously smart, you must train your eyes to see repetition, your mind to see cause and effect, and your memory to store lessons rather than just events. Because when you learn to recognize patterns, life opens up in new ways. You become harder to deceive, harder to surprise, harder to discourage, and much harder to stop. Chapter 5. Outsmart problems by anticipating them. One of the greatest advantages dangerously smart people have is not that they solve problems faster, it's that they prevent many problems from ever appearing. In the first place, they look ahead. They anticipate. They pay attention to the early signals that most people ignore, and this changes the way they move through life. Instead of constantly putting out fires, they build systems that keep fires from starting. Instead of reacting in panic, they prepare quietly. Prevention is one of the most underrated forms of intelligence because it doesn't feel dramatic, but it is incredibly powerful. Think about it. Solving a problem costs time, energy, and resources. Preventing a problem preserves time, energy, and resources. Prevention protects momentum. It protects confidence. It protects clarity. And yet, many people operate with the "I'll handle it when it happens" mindset. They wait for emergencies. They wait for pain. They wait for consequences. And by the time they finally respond, the problem has usually multiplied financially, emotionally, or socially. Anticipation is smarter than repair. To anticipate problems, you have to train yourself to think beyond the immediate moment. You have to ask, if I continue on this path, what happens next? Or if I make this decision, what could go wrong? These are not negative questions. They are strategic questions. There's a big difference between negativity and foresight. Negativity focuses on fear. Foresight focuses on preparation. One drains you, the other protects you. Dangerously smart thinkers run simulations in their head, not complex mathematical simulations, practical ones. They visualize scenarios, consequences, and responses. They consider alternatives and contingencies. Contingency planning is a hallmark of intelligent decision-making. It ensures that when life pushes back, the push doesn't break you. When you have options, pressure decreases. When you lack options, pressure increases. Now, let's talk about patterns again. Because patterns are deeply connected to anticipation, problems rarely appear without warning. There are always early indicators, subtle behaviors, small inconsistencies, quiet discomfort, little mistakes, recurring delays. People who end up blindsided usually ignored the early signs. The signs were there, they just didn't want to see them. Smart thinkers look for weak signals. They don't wait for the crisis to become loud. Anticipation also requires emotional discipline. Most people don't think ahead because thinking ahead forces them to face uncomfortable truths. It reveals vulnerabilities. It exposes risks. It makes them admit that their current situation may not be sustainable. But suppression is not a strategy. Avoidance is not intelligence. Facing reality early gives you more time to adapt. And adaptation is often the difference between survival and failure. One of the most practical methods for anticipating problems is to reverse your thinking. Instead of asking, "How do I succeed?" ask, How do I fail? This is a mental model known as inversion. It forces you to identify failure points, the things most likely to ruin your plans. Once you identify them, you can build safeguards. This approach is used by engineers, investors, military strategists, and high-level decision-makers. It works in everyday life, too. If you can eliminate the obvious failure points, success becomes dramatically easier. Let's explore another angle: problem anticipation in relationships and communication. Many conflicts don't come out of nowhere. They come from unclear agreements, unmet expectations, poor boundaries, or ignored signals. Smart communicators anticipate emotional responses before they speak. They think about how their words might be received, how someone might interpret their intentions, and what outcomes those interpretations might produce. Communication becomes strategic rather than impulsive. In business, anticipation is even more crucial. Entire industries have been disrupted because the leaders failed to anticipate changes in technology, consumer behavior, or competition. Meanwhile, the strategic leaders saw the shift coming early and positioned themselves. They made moves before the demand arrived, not after. That's what makes the difference between being reactive and being ahead of the curve. But there's a final aspect to anticipation that people rarely talk about: anticipating your own weaknesses. It's easy to point out external risks, much harder to acknowledge internal risks: procrastination, ego impatience, ignorance, stubbornness, emotional impulsiveness. Most of the problems people face are not caused by the outside world. They are caused by their own habits colliding with reality. When you anticipate your own flaws, you give yourself a chance to correct before they sabotage you. And that may be the highest form of prevention. Let's be clear: anticipation will not eliminate all problems. Life will always have surprises. But it will eliminate unnecessary problems, the ones that drain you, delay you, and discourage you. And every unnecessary problem you prevent gives you more room to pursue meaningful goals, instead of constantly repairing damage. That's why, dangerously, smart people seem to move through life with more ease. It's not that their path is easier. It's that they learned how to avoid creating additional friction. Along the way to outsmart problems is to think ahead. To think ahead is to respect reality. And to respect reality is to accept that the smartest move is often the one that prevents the chaos from ever starting. Chapter 6. Make decisions like a chess player. Decisions determine your direction, and direction determines your destiny. If you want to become dangerously smart, you must elevate the way you make decisions. Most people decide based on convenience, impulse, or emotion. Chess players decide based on position, outcome, and strategy. They don't just ask, "What should I do right now?" They ask, "What will this move create 3 steps from now?" That difference alone separates amateurs from strategists. In every area of life, chess is a useful metaphor because it teaches something vital. A good move is not just good in the moment. It is good in the sequence. Many people make decisions that look good instantly but collapse later. They take shortcuts for short-term benefits that carry long-term costs. Others make decisions that feel difficult in the moment, but create long-term openings. When you shift your decision-making from emotional impulse to strategic thinking, life stops feeling random and starts feeling intentional. Strategic decision-making begins with awareness of the board. In chess, You need to know where the pieces are before you decide where to move. In life, the board includes your environment, your resources, your relationships, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your constraints. A move made without understanding the board is just guessing. Guessing might occasionally work, but consistency comes from clarity. Once you have awareness, the next layer is foresight. Chess players don't just think about their own move. They think about how others will respond to it. They anticipate counter moves. In life, every decision has a ripple effect. When you speak, people respond. When you make a financial move, the market responds. When you set a boundary, others adjust. When you change a habit, your environment reacts. Strategic thinkers ask, if I do this, what happens next? And then, and after that. This ability to simulate outcomes is what turns decisions into strategy instead of chance. Another principle from chess that applies to life is the distinction between trading and sacrificing. A trade is when you exchange one resource for another of similar value. A sacrifice is when you give up something valuable now to gain something more valuable later. Most breakthroughs in life require sacrifice. You might sacrifice comfort for growth, time for skill, ego for feedback, or short-term enjoyment for long-term freedom. Short-term thinkers avoid sacrifice because they focus on what they lose. Long-term thinkers embrace sacrifice because they focus on what they gain. Chess also teaches restraint. Not every opportunity must be taken. Not every opening is worth pursuing. Some positions are traps disguised as options. In life, these traps show up as shiny distractions. Easy money, fast validation, or shortcuts that bypass the real work. Strategic people learn to pause instead of pounce. The pause buys them time to observe, and observation prevents regret.